All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a classic showdown today. A government taxing authority on one side and a hospital dedicated to saving lives on the other. I mean, it sounds like a total mismatch, right? But as we peel back the layers of this story, we're going to see how just a few specific words in a legal document can completely change the fate of an entire institution.
So, can the government tax a nonprofit charity hospital? You'd naturally assume that a noble institution dedicated to helping the sick, especially the poorest among us, is completely immune from taxes. It just feels like common sense. Why would the government take money away from an organization that's essentially doing the government's job of caring for its citizens? But, as you'll see in this explainer, the law actually has a massive hidden catch. Empathy doesn't write the tax code, and the reality of how a charity keeps its lights on can sometimes put it directly in the crosshairs of the tax collector.
To figure out where the line is actually drawn, we have to look at a huge landmark decision handed down by the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the Philippines. The case is Lunc Center of the Philippines versus Quezon City. And look, this isn't just some dry dispute over paperwork. This is a foundational case that strictly defines exactly what it means to be a charity in the eyes of the state, and maybe more importantly, what a charity is legally allowed to do with its own property.
Okay, over 4.5 million pesos. Let that sink in for a second. That is the exact staggering amount the Quezon City assessor demanded from the Lunc Center of the Philippines in a sudden 1993 real property tax assessment. Imagine being the administrators of a nonprofit hospital running on razor-thin margins and government subsidies, and out of nowhere getting a tax bill for millions of pesos just for your land and building. They immediately filed a claim for exemption, totally confident that their status as a charity would protect them. But no, the city assessor denied it flat out.
So, Section 1. What exactly makes a charity?
To really get why this multi-million peso bill was such a shock to the system, we first have to look at the undeniable good the Lunc Center does. They were created by Presidential Decree No. 1823 specifically to combat lung diseases for the Filipino people. They're a non-stock, non-profit entity relying on annual government subsidies. During the dispute, they pointed out that 60%, more than half of their 282 hospital beds, were allotted entirely to charity patients, and a massive portion of their resources goes to indigent outpatients. They are literally operating at a net loss to serve the public.
And you know what? The Supreme Court firmly agreed that the Lunc Center undeniably qualifies as a charitable institution. Legally speaking, a charity exists to benefit an indefinite number of persons and to lessen the burden on the government. The Lunc Center does exactly that, day in and day out. By treating sick citizens who just can't afford care, they're taking a massive weight off the public healthcare system. So if they are so undeniably a charity, why the giant tax bill?
Well, here is where the legal mystery begins, because the Quezon City assessor didn't just pull that tax bill out of thin air. They noticed a pretty lucrative side hustle happening on the hospital's property. The Lunc Center was actually making millions by leasing out parts of its ground floor and a large vacant lot to commercial enterprises. We're talking leased spaces for a canteen, small stores, and private clinics for doctors who are charging patients for professional services. On top of that, a huge chunk of land on the corner of Quezon Avenue and Elliptical Road was leased out to a private commercial enterprise, the Elliptical Orchids and Garden Center.
Which brings us to Section 2, the constitutional catch.
So, the big question, does making a profit on the side totally cancel out an institution's tax-exempt status? To find out, we have to look at a legal principle known as strictissimi juris, which basically means incredibly strict interpretation. When it comes to taxes, taxation is the absolute rule, and exemption is the super rare exception. Anyone claiming a tax exemption has to prove it with absolute clarity. It's like a detective searching for a hidden loophole. You can't just imply an exemption. It has to be written in the law in language that is way too plain to be mistaken. The burden of proof was resting entirely on the Lunc Center.
Now, the Lunc Center tried to argue under older interpretations of the law, pointing back to precedents established under the 1935 Constitution. Under those older rules, if a property was used exclusively for charity, even if that charity was partially funded by commercial leases on the premises, it was generally considered good enough to get the exemption. The hospital's logic made sense on paper. Sure, we collect rent from the orchid garden and the private clinics, but all of that money goes straight back into buying medicine and maintaining beds for our poorest patients. Therefore, the ultimate use is exclusively charitable.
But the Supreme Court hit them with a massive reality check. The Lunc Center was relying on outdated law. The 1987 Constitution totally raised the bar. It didn't just say exclusively anymore. It added two extremely heavy-hitting words, actually and directly. For a property to be tax-exempt today, it must be actually, directly, and exclusively used for charitable purposes. The wording changed, and, as the court made very clear, you simply cannot ignore that shift.
The court defined exclusively with zero wiggle room. It means possessed and enjoyed to the exclusion of others, solely. You can't just say, well, the dominant use or the principal use is charity and call it a day. That doesn't fly. Just because the vast majority of the hospital is used to save lives doesn't mean the entire property gets a free pass if some parts of it are being used to make a commercial profit.
All right, let's move to Section 3, the Supreme Court's split verdict.
So how did this actually end? It wasn't just a simple yes or no for either side. Instead, the court dropped a definitive, absolute rule. What is meant by actual, direct, and exclusive use is the direct application of the property itself to the charitable purpose. The court clarified that it literally does not matter if the millions of pesos in lease income are used entirely to fund the charity wards. What matters is the physical, actual use of the space itself. It is not the use of the income that determines the tax exemption, it is the use of the real estate.
So they essentially split the baby here. The parts of the property that are actually treating patients, the hospital beds, the medical wings, those are completely tax-exempt. But every single square meter leased for commerce, the private physician clinics, the canteen, and, yep, the elliptical orchids and garden center is 100% taxable. The court actually ordered the Quezon City assessor to literally pull out a tape measure, map out the commercial spaces, and compute the taxes owed solely on those specific areas.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a real tension to ponder. The law is crystal clear now. The physical use of the property dictates the tax, not the noble intent of the income. But if we step back from the strict legal text for a second, does strict tax enforcement on commercial side hustles protect the public from charities acting like tax-free corporations? Or does it ultimately punish the very charities that are just innovatively trying to keep the lights on so they can treat more sick people? It's an incredibly tricky balance between the letter of the law and the spirit of giving, and it's one that nonprofits are still navigating today. Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.